Lawyers, what was your "oh crap" moment in court? Story 1. Story from a friend of mine. He was defending a guy in court, don't remember what he was charged with. The main witness for prosecution was on the stand and was asked if she could identify the defendant. She was scanning the courtroom and seemed confused. My friend was already silently celebrating because if she couldn't identify him, then he could probably get all the charges dropped. As he was mentally adding this case to the win file, he happened to glance over at his client who had just helpfully raised his hand to make it easier for her to identify him. Even the judge facepalmed on that one. Story 2. Sat in the public gallery at a bail hearing for a man accused of heinous crimes against a very young female relative. The judge started laying out the conditions of bail, and one of them was to surrender his passport. The man turned to his attorney and said loudly words to the effects of, "But you said that I could fly back to my home country." The judge stopped himself and revoked the man's bail. Story 3. I was prosecuting a contempt action in family court, something that basically never works, and everyone in the room could tell that I was winning. The other side was unprepared out of arrogance, and I was basically ripping this guy to shreds on cross-examination, which his lawyer didn't even think would happen because he expected the case to be dismissed. At the end of the trial, the judge ruled for me and stated that she found the defendant's testimony to be untrustworthy. I was shocked at winning a contempt trial to begin with, but then this exchange happened. Defendant's attorney: Your Honor, now that you have found my client's testimony to be untrustworthy, I am requesting a continuance in order to prepare further witnesses. This concept is shocking in and of itself because to even think that you can bring more witnesses after you rest your case is laughable. Judge: You had your shot and you missed, counsel. Defendant's attorney: Your Honor, there was no way that I could have anticipated that you'd find my client's testimony untrustworthy, and as such, I didn't have the opportunity to prepare other witnesses in support of this position. Judge: That might be an argument for your carrier, counsel, but it does not hold water with me. See you this afternoon for sentencing. The judge basically told the lawyer on the record in front of his client that she expects him to get sued for malpractice because he messed up so royally. That crap was mind-blowing on multiple levels. It sounds like that lawyer got absolutely roasted in court. It's one thing to lose a case, but to have a judge essentially call you out for not doing your job properly is a whole other level of embarrassment. I'm surprised the lawyer didn't just crawl under a rock and never come back out after that. I guess it just goes to show that being unprepared and arrogant in the courtroom is a recipe for disaster. Story 4. I was the defendant representing a nonprofit that I volunteered for. The plaintiff was a 60-something grandma who was looking for a retirement settlement after falling out of her jacked-up pickup truck in our parking lot. The premise of her case was that our parking lot was in bad shape. It was, and that she fell into a pothole and broke her leg, which resulted in having her to take Comadin and diminished her enjoyment of salads at the Friday night fish fry. Yeah, really. It was going along fine until my lawyer put up a picture of the pothole taken the day of the incident, filled to the brim with water after a recent rain. He asked the lady if she could have gotten her foot wet, to which she replied that she couldn't recall. He talked a little bit more about how perhaps if her foot wasn't wet, it might have been because she fell out of the truck and didn't really fall into the pothole. He asked again if her foot was wet, and she affirmed that it was. Her foot was wet. The oh crap moment came when he went back to his desk, flipped through her deposition, and read the part where she was extremely adamant that her foot wasn't wet. Then he did some fancy legal stuff, and the case was thrown out, and I went back to work. Story 5. I was just interning in court during law school, but I'm a lawyer now. Fight in a club, someone had broken someone else's jaw and had 6 friends with him that insisted that he'd been identified wrongly because he never had a beard and the victim said he had a beard. They used a very specific phrasing to the tune of, "My friend doesn't have facial hair because he is a professional in the food industry and it would go against the regulations." After 3 of the witnesses had repeated the same exact phrasing, the judge stopped one to ask if he knew what a couple of the terms in that line meant, and the witness couldn't explain it. Defense lawyer got busted for instructing the witnesses. She'd also gotten the defendant to reject a plea deal that exchanged prison time for a fine and community service. Story 6. Not exactly in court, but I was defending a juvenile robbery case where there was very little evidence. There was supposed to be 2 guys, but they only picked up this one kid. He had stolen property on him, and he was picked up outside of his own house wearing different clothes from the victim had initially said. This kid was on the honor roll at school, and his family seemed kind and were involved. He wrote poetry and played instruments. I actually believe that it was a legit mistaken identity case. I went to meet one of the kid's mentors for a character reference, and he exactly matched the description of the other robber. So I guess that's what you would call poetic justice, or in this case, poetic injustice, since the poor guy got blamed for something he didn't do. But hey, at least the mentor was there to make sure that the real culprit got caught, right? Story 7. Lawyer here. I had a pre-trial conference at 9 a.m. at a court about 2 hours away. So I wake up super early to drive in crappy weather to the conference. I get there and we're waiting for the other in-town attorney. All the while, I'm grumbling to myself how I'm out of town and I can still make it on time. And finally, the court calls the other attorney's office and gets a receptionist who tells us through tears that the other attorney passed away the night before. Needless to say, I was just happy to still be alive, and we rescheduled for a few months later. Story 8. I was interning during law school prosecuting domestic violence cases. The deputy DA asked me to talk for the first time during a guy's arraignment for beating his wife. An arraignment is when the defendant hears the charges against him and pleads guilty or not guilty. When the judge calls on me to speak, I got insanely nervous and told the defendant that his charge carried a maximum penalty of 30 years, when it was actually 30 days. He freaks out, the crowd, who some of them were family and friends, gasps, and the judge basically stops me and says, "I think you mean 30 days, counselor," after which everyone, including the defendant, laughed at me. Story 9. Represented a pro bono client that had just turned 18 and was charged with serious property damage. I walk into his bail hearing, and the judge looks at him and goes, "I knew you would be back as an adult." The judge then turns to me and says, "Counselor, you may want to learn about your client's history. No bail." Story 10. Not in court, but a deposition. Plaintiff in a harassment case that was suspected to be paid with role-playing with her boss kept a very detailed adult diary on her work computer. At one point, she was asked to read from the diary for the record and asked if she had written the accounts and if they were true. She was asked at several points if she wanted her new husband to leave the room while she did this, but declined. Let's just say it was extremely kinky. She confirmed it was true, and the only mention of her now husband was that he was boring in bed, but she was going to marry him because she couldn't get her first, second, or third choice. He ended up leaving on his own after she read that part aloud and confirmed it was him that she was writing about. Yeah, I don't know what's more cringeworthy, the fact that she kept a kinky diary on her work computer or the fact that she willingly read it out loud during a deposition. I mean, I know that some people like to share intimate details, but that's just asking for a whole nother level of too much information. Let's not forget the poor husband who had to sit through that whole thing. I'm surprised he didn't run out of the room screaming, "I can't unhear that." But hey, at least she found a way to make her workplace a little bit more exciting, right? Maybe she should consider a career in writing adult fiction. I hear it's quite lucrative these days. Story 11. I think this qualifies, though it wasn't me that was the lawyer. I got called for jury duty and was at the jury selection phase, and they asked if anyone here thinks that they should not blah blah blah. The defendant was in the room, and I raised my hand. The defending lawyer looked at me and said, "Oh, this ought to be good," and asked me to explain. I suggested that I tell them in private. He insisted I tell the courtroom, and I said, "Okay, well, I probably shouldn't be on this jury because I was on a previous jury for this man who returned a guilty verdict." Lawyer's face went, "Oh, crap." Commotion ensued, and we waited a while they look up their records. Yep, verified, the whole jury was now tainted. Everyone goes home, and they had to start over. Story 12. Do you see the defendant here in court? The witness and victim looks at each jury member, then everyone in the audience. Nope. The judge hides his face behind the file holder. Are you sure? Maybe over on this side. The witness looks confused. I'm not sure. And then I point at the defendant. Maybe over at this table by that lawyer? Yeah, maybe. Keep in mind the defendant and victim knew each other very well. Story 13. Not a lawyer, but was working at the jail when an inmate came back from court and immediately went on suicide watch. Apparently, he was up for a plea deal and was only looking at 6 months, but started questioning some of the facts, which let in a ton of previously denied evidence. This new evidence linked him to 6 breaking and enterings and rapes. He walked out of court facing a 99-year sentence to which he was certain to get, all because he opened his mouth. Story 14. Not a lawyer, but I had a big oh crap moment. I was in court for driving while suspended in a county and in front of a judge that were both notorious for putting people who did that in jail. My license wasn't supposed to be suspended. A pencil pusher forgot to press a button or something, and it never got unsuspended after the time was up. Now, I had proof of this, but I was still really nervous. The guy who went up to the judge before me walked up to the table where we're supposed to stand, sat down, and put his feet up on the table. The judge asked him what he was doing, and he gave a flippant answer and basically told the judge to get screwed. This seriously pissed the judge off. The judge went off on this guy, and the guy gave everything right back to him, pissing him off more and more. The judge ended up jailing him for contempt and had the bailiff cuff the guy and put him in a chair off to the side to await the marshals who would transport him to the jail. Then my name gets called. The judge is looking at me like I'm fresh meat and he's a great white shark. I'm already thinking to myself, okay, if this judge puts you in jail, run over and beat the crap out of the guy that just pissed off the judge so badly. He's why you're going to jail. The judge looks down at his paperwork, backed up at me, and says, "You're Mr. Last Name?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Yeah, we were talking about you earlier, and I'm going to void your arrest and dismiss your case. Your license was supposed to be valid, and you shouldn't even be here." I let out a huge sigh. The judge asked me if I was okay, and I said that I'd been a bit worried, especially given the guy that was right behind me in line. The judge said, "Hey, don't worry about him. He won't be seeing anything that isn't behind bars for about 90 days, and then laughed. Well, talk about dodging a bullet. I can only imagine the relief this person felt when the judge dismissed their case. But the real MVP here is the guy who got himself jailed for contempt of court, inadvertently taking the heat off our protagonist. I mean, sure, getting thrown in jail isn't funny, but the fact that his antics provided the perfect distraction for the judge to forget about the poor guy who was actually innocent is just hilarious. I can only imagine the look on the guy's face when the judge called his name and he proceeded to dismiss the case. It's like he won the lottery or something. Moral of the story, don't be a jerk in court, especially when you're in front of a judge known for handing out harsh punishments. You might end up inadvertently helping someone else's case. Story 15. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a character witness for my childhood dog in a civil trial between our neighbors and my parents. Opposing counsel was questioning me, and I wasn't even out of elementary school at the time, and he asked if our dog was aggressive. She was a Rottweiler and very loving and incredibly protective of me and my siblings. His final question to me is one that I will never forget. He asked, "Did your father tell you what to say before you came into court today?" I responded, "Yes." Then he asked, "What did he tell you to say?" And I said, "The truth." Now, I was too young to remember the courtroom reaction, but according to my father, the judge audibly gawked and the opposing counsel lost all the wind out of his sails. Story 16. Not a lawyer, but I was on a jury once for a murder trial. Got selected and the trial started almost immediately. The man was charged with murdering his neighbor. They made their opening statements and there was even a bloody note. It wasn't terribly long, but they clearly put a lot of effort into their strategies and were ready for battle. Now, the first witness was called, and it was the son of the man on trial. I forget the first question, but it didn't matter. He immediately broke down crying and invoked his Fifth Amendment right. Everyone freaks out. The judge and the lawyers are like, "What?" The jury had no clue what was going on, but we were quickly ushered out immediately after that. Now, a few minutes later, it was explained to us what happened. The judge declared a mistrial. The prosecutor must have suspected that the father was taking the fall for the son who actually murdered the neighbor. Rather than risk losing, there was a mistrial while they sorted out who to actually charge and try. Story 17. I was involved in a pretty messy custody case. The other party was a mess and had kept the child from my client for a few weeks. OP was playing lots of stupid games and kept requesting continuances. I requested a drug test, which the judge ordered. However, the OP didn't show up for it. To clarify, he did show up, he just stood in front of the toilet for literally 2 hours and claimed that he couldn't pee. I was representing the plaintiff, so the burden was on me, and I called multiple witnesses that testified to the defendant's drug use. So, opposing counsel decides to call their client for a direct examination and asks, "You don't use heroin and crack, right?" That is, for the non-lawyers, a very stupid question for many reasons, especially considering his client didn't show up for his drug test. However, I fully expected the defendant to just lie and say that he was clean. After the question was asked, there was a really long pause and the defendant said, "Yes, I do both of those drugs." My head almost exploded. I didn't even ask any questions on cross-examination because I didn't want to muddy the waters. I won and the child is doing great. Story 18. The best oh crap moments are when your opposing counsel or opposing client says or does something that wins the case for you. True, in civil cases, you usually know what will happen ahead of time, but in my state discovery in smaller civil cases is more limited, and clients don't always want to spend $30,000 when we get the same result for $10,000. In an adverse possession case, the witness only needed to say, "I used that area as my backyard," and I fully expected him to say this. It would harm my case, but I knew that I could get around it. When asked about his use of the area, he said, "No, I never really went back there, didn't use it at all. Lost the case for the other side, and I could barely keep a straight face." It was completely opposite of what the witness had told opposing counsel off the record, and apparently under the penalty of perjury made him change the story. I had another case about losing multi-unit dwelling insurance because a guy's place was a fire hazard. I asked him if his personal insurer knew about the fire hazard, and he said, yeah, and the jerks canceled my policy. I also love it when I have a difficult party on the other side and the judge rips them a new one. I had a convoluted case with a lot of parties about nothing at all. The plaintiff was heinous. 6 or 7 attorneys were working out calendars with the judge when the plaintiff starts yelling at her attorney from across the courtroom because she didn't like that he had conceded some little non-issue. The judge told her to sit down and shut up. I was sad that the case settled because she would have been amazing on the stand. It's always a great feeling when the other side inadvertently hands you the win on a silver platter. It's like they think that they're playing chess, but you're really playing checkers with a blindfold on. And when their own witnesses flip the script, it's like Christmas morning for me. But favorite is when the judge puts the smackdown on a difficult party. It's like watching a superhero in action. The plaintiff in that case must have thought that she was a real hotshot, but the judge put her in her place faster than you can say, objection. It's moments like these that just make you love what you do, right? Story 19. I'm not a lawyer, but a court case I was involved with went this way. My ex-mother-in-law was a crazy one. Me and my wife at the time had cut her off almost completely. Every once in a while, she would give in and let my mom visit, which always turned out badly. And now eventually, we got divorced and I got full custody. The mother-in-law went nuts and decided to sue me for custody. I looked over the law, and for any form of visitation or custody that you need to have had contact in the last 6 months, and she hadn't seen them for over a year. So we go to court. I can't afford a lawyer, but the law was pretty clear. She goes through 3 lawyers. Each of them quit in turn. So she finally winds up representing herself. During the last hearing, she was talking to the judge and said something to the effect of, I don't want to get custody of them, I just want to be able to visit. The judge then asked her point blank, well, this is a custody hearing. Are you telling me you no longer want to get custody? She said yes, and the judge dismissed the case immediately. Story 20. Represented a woman charged with multiple serious felonies. She insisted that in the months before the offense, she had been seriously dating one of the detectives who ultimately wound up investigating and testifying in her case. For a variety of reasons, I trusted this client and believed her, even though the detective never disclosed the relationship in his report. So, during his testimony, I asked, Detective Smith, you had a romantic relationship with Miss Defendant, correct? He goes, what? No, and is visibly offended. The judge looks at me like I've lost my mind. The Commonwealth attorney audibly says, what? And I'm freaking out because a large part of my cross-examination and argument was focused on the bias formed by the prior relationship. And now I've got nothing, and I've lost all credibility. I try again. Detective Smith, have you had an adult relationship with Miss Defendant? As the Commonwealth rises to object, the judge starts to scold me, and the detective goes, oh yeah, we've had fun, but it just wasn't very romantic. Well, that sounds like a classic case of, oops, I put my foot in my mouth, and I'm sure it was a big embarrassment at the time, but at least you were able to recover and still make your point. But hey, maybe it even lightened the mood in the courtroom for a moment. Who knows, maybe you'll even become known as the lawyer who isn't afraid to ask the tough questions and potentially awkward questions. In the comments, has anyone witnessed someone just really screw themselves in court because they just couldn't keep their mouth shut?